Okay, ladies and gentlemen, welcome along to today's webinar. I'm John James and I'm delighted that you've been able to join with us today. I just love webinars as they allow us to easily gather together like this and hear the latest information without any of us needing to travel. Today's webinar is all about business storytelling. Our guest presenter today is Shawn Callahan, the founder of Anecdote. I've been receiving Shawn's newsletters for several years, and I'm currently reading his recently released book, Putting Stories to Work, Mastering Business Storytelling. And I tell you, I haven't finished it yet, but I've been really enjoying working through it. And I was chatting with Shawn the other day, and he mentioned that the hardcover version is already sold out, and with little surprise, as it's been described as the most practical guide available to developing your skills as a business storyteller. So Shawn, thanks for joining us today. Hey, the weather here in Toowoomba today it's just gorgeous. It's a sunny blue sky and about 23 degrees. So you're down in Melbourne. What's the weather like there today?
Hi John. Yeah, no, it's great to be here. It's a cloudy, kind of drizzly day today. Actually, a bit of a change from the lovely sunny weather we've been having the last few days.
So Shawn, we can hear you clearly and we can see your screen. So over to you.
It was actually really nice to see those pictures you were showing of your backyard and a terrific honey extraction method. Someone's come up with a great idea there. In fact, my career actually started off in the natural resource management space. I did my degree in geography and archaeology. My honours thesis was entitled Mid-Channel Shoal Formation in a Macrotidal Environment. So I did up in Western Australia in the Ord River, looking at how, sort of the whole geomorphology of the islands up there. But moving from there to, running a business around storytelling, sort of the turning point for me was actually doing a project with the Australian Geological Survey Organisation. They had me doing this project where I was helping the scientists document their scientific data sets. And naively, if you like, I sort of just created this system, database system, went around to the scientists and said, guys, I want you to document all your data sets. And they just looked at me like, you've got to be joking, right? It was like, there was no way in the world they were going to do this. It was a hard job and there was no incentive. Luckily, I had a very talented mentor, a guy called David Johnson. He's a geologist, and he said to me, Shawn, you got to remember that here in AGSO, it's about publish or perish, right? If you want to get to people to do something in this area, you've got to link it to that. So we went back to the drawing board, and we came up with this idea of a published data set, right? And so to publish the data set, you had to describe the data set, and you had to put it into this system. But most importantly, it was connected to the merit promotion scheme, but also the official citations, if you like, for that particular scientist. We did that. We invited them to publish their data sets, and it was this instant lineup. And at that point, I went, hang in there, this is really interesting, something's really changing. So I started getting interested in how, people's behaviour could be changed, and, and the stories that you tell to do that. And that was really the beginning, if you like, for me moving from sort of directly working in that natural resource management area to moving over to sort of organisational change issues. But today I want to really touch on this idea of how do you go about building your skills as a business storyteller. And business, I'm using that in a very broad sense. You could be in a government organisation, a non-profit, a corporation. It doesn't really matter, as long as you're trying to achieve, good work. I guess one of the key things for me is that, you don't really get anything done until you have a process. And so the very basic process that I'm proposing for business storytelling is knowing how to go about and discovering good stories to tell, then knowing how to remember those stories so you can tell them off the top of your head without, PowerPoint slides or, any sort of references. Looking at different ways of sharing those stories. What do you have to do to get your message across when you share a story? And then finally, stories become stale over time, so how do you refresh them? But I guess sitting underneath all of that is this idea that, for me, it doesn't work until storytelling becomes a habit. So just like brushing your teeth is a habit, getting to that point where you share a story as a habitual way of communicating. And I find it's a building a habit requires you to understand there's some triggers involved in habit formation. The first trigger is that, something has to happen that triggers the action. So, with brushing your teeth, you walk into the bathroom and you go, yes, must brush my teeth. Then you do the habit, do the action, and then you get a reward. And with brushing your teeth, it's the frothy, sort of experience in your mouth, which, by the way, is not required at all to have clean teeth. It's something that the makers of Colgate and others have realised is a very addictive thing for us. So that's why they built that in. So the same is sort of true with storytelling. You've got to have a trigger. You do the action of telling the story, and then your reward. And the best trigger I find is just having an opinion. So when you find yourself and catch yourself being very opinionated, that's when you should be thinking about, okay, what's the example? What's the story I can tell to illustrate my opinion? You share the story, and then the reward is the response you get from your audience. Right? You sort of see them leaning in, you see them, really understanding what you're talking about, but more importantly, somewhere down the track, you hear them retelling that story. That's sort of like the biggest accolade, if you like, for oral storytelling. And by the way, I'm really interested in oral storytelling. That's the thing that I focus on, not so much written stories. So how do you go about doing this? How do you discover these stories? Well, first thing is that you have to get a good sense of the type of stories you're after. So I like to think of storytelling along a spectrum. One end of that spectrum is big S storytelling, and that's, for me, Hollywood storytelling. It's what screenwriters do and authors and, all that fabulous stuff that you see on the big screen. But I find that that's not where we need to be when we want to do storytelling, business storytelling. We need to be down the other end of the spectrum. We want to look at real-life experiences, things that happened just the other day. That becomes the repertoire of stories that we can tell that actually make a point. And this means just walking around your organisation, hearing the things that are going on, and recounting that as a way of giving people an insight into something that you're trying to get out there into the world. To do this well, discovery is really based on this idea that you can spot stories. I don't know if you guys have noticed this, but just recently, the last few years, everyone seems to be talking about stories. What's the story of our organisation? What's our narrative? How do we get our messages stick with stories? They're talking about stories, but a lot of people are not telling stories. Right? So how do you go about knowing what's the difference between an opinion or a perspective and a story? Well, here's a little framework that we put together just so that you can say, yep, and spot a story from 1,000 paces. The first thing in the framework is that stories really always start with a time marker. So when you hear someone say, oh, just the other day, or oh, when I got started in my career, that's a type of time marker. It might be on Tuesday morning I was walking into the office. Again, a time marker. Or it might be just a vague time marker. Oh, a while back. When you hear that, you can sort of almost be guaranteed to hear a story that's coming, right? If it's not a time marker, it's a place marker. Someone will say, oh, we were all in the boardroom and Jim walked in. And that's the beginning of a story. Stories happen in a time and a place. So next thing that we're listening out for are events. This happened, then this happened, and because of that, this happened. There's a kind of cause and effect built up in these events. And when we hear events, we know we're sort of in a story. Third thing we're listening out for are people. People's names are a big giveaway, people interacting, dialogue. Dialogue actually can't be delivered unless it's in a story. We do it all the time when we're chatting to people. We say things like, oh yeah, I bumped into Lucy the other day. You know what she said? And then we do the Lucy dialogue. Right? Now, let me give you an example of using these three things, and you tell me whether this is a story or not. So I got up early this morning, had my shower, got my breakfast, got a few things organised, and then jumped on the computer ready for this webinar. What do you reckon? Put your hands up. Let's try the hand system here. Put your hands up if you think that was a story. What are we getting, John? Are we getting any hands put up?
Yeah, about a dozen people have put up their hands.
Okay. Well, it comes close to a story that it has those three things, but it's missing one element, right? And that element is you need something that's unanticipated for it to be a story. Otherwise, it's just a recount. The great thing about stories is you should listen to a story and go, oh, really, that's interesting, or at least raise your eyebrows at some point. We're not talking about tear-jerking, emotional stories here. We're talking about, people having experiences and recounting that experience to make a business point. And of course, it doesn't really become a business story until we have that business point. So think about trying to spot these stories. Once you know this, by the way, it's a bit of a curse, I have to say, because all of a sudden you start to see stories everywhere. You'll be watching someone present and you'll be going, oh, there's a story, there's another story. Oh, gee, no story for a long time. That's a little bit boring. Oh, there's another story. I tell you what, that's probably a good place for us to break for some questions. What do you think, John? Is this a good timing for some questions?
Yes, so folks, this is a great time for you to type some questions in that Q&A panel down the bottom. So I've just got a couple here already. So Shawn, and you may cover this later on, but do you have some suggestions for people who struggle to remember all the details in a story?
Yes. Well, I mean, the main thing is that you don't have to know all the details in a story. If there are very important details you must have, like for example, people's names can be really important for a story to make a difference. Or it could be the actual numbers and dates. And to remember those, in some ways, it's really the rote aspect of remembering a story. But later on, I'll teach you a method for remembering stories.
Okay, that's good. That's all for the moment. So how about we move on with your presentation? Thanks, Shawn.
Terrific. There you go. There we were about a slide away from remembering stories. Now, the thing about remembering stories is, I mean, stories in themselves are extremely memorable, right? And part of the reason for that is that a good story will actually generate imagery, right? It's where when you're listening to the story, you can actually see it happening. I mean, I don't know, when I was telling that story about my experience at AGSO, could people sort of see the scientists, coming up to me and going, yeah, no, I'm not having anything to do with that. If you can create a story that has a little bit of imagery, that will actually help people remember stories. There's a great experiment done where they showed people 10,000 images. It took the group a week to look at the images. Then they went away for about 4 weeks, and then they would come back and they had to look at the original images, but they were right next to an image they'd never seen before, and they just had to choose which image they saw 4 weeks ago. Anyway, out of 1,000 images, or 10,000 images, they were actually able to pick over 80% accuracy, right? So we got this, how we say, oh yeah, I remember a face, but I can't remember a name. It's this ability that we have. We're really good at remembering images. So that's one of the ways in which we remember. The other thing that we remember stories is emotion. They say, you remember what you feel. And, you've had this experience yourself. You go to a presentation, weeks later someone asks you what it's about, and you can tell them how you felt about that person and how you felt about the presentation, and you might be able to pull out some key, sort of elements of it. But in many cases, information just washes over us, and it's the feelings that are left in some of the images. I just want to just share with you some information. It's a bit of a pop quiz, if you like. I'll just show you this next slide. I'll just read these out for you. So John walked on the roof, Bill picked up the eggs, Pete put on a helmet, Jim gave a speech, Frank built a boat, Harvey flipped the electric switch, and Ted wrote the play. So, I'm just being given that information. I just want you to maybe type into the question and answer box, who picked up the eggs? Throw that in. John, you can tell me if we're getting some...
The eggs, okay. Yep. Bill has been suggested.
Bill,
John, yep. Bill, Jim, Bill.
Few Bills, John, Bill, Jim. Okay, what about who walked on the roof?
Okay, let's see what people say. We've got John, Tim, Pete, John, Jack, Tim, Tom. Waiting for some names that weren't even mentioned in the story now.
Yeah, well, let me give you another list, and we'll sort of see how this one goes.
Great.
So Santa Claus walked on the roof, the Easter Bunny picked up the eggs, the Viking put on the helmet, JFK gave a speech, Noah built a boat, Edison flipped the electric switch, William Shakespeare wrote the play. So now let's have a think. Who picked up the eggs? You type that in.
Yep, here they come. Lots of Easter bunnies. Easter bunny, Easter bunny.
Lots of Easter bunny. Yeah, well, now what about who walked on the roof then? Just to double check.
Yep, good old Santa. Santa Claus, Santa Claus. Yep, well done, everyone.
All consistent, all consistent.
Oh.
So here's the thing. So the first list, of course, is just a list of disconnected facts. We've never seen them before. They don't really mean anything to you. The second list, each line is essentially backed up with a story that we know. It's connected with emotion. It's connected with experience. And as a result, we don't just see the line, we actually have that connection to all those things, and that information all of a sudden becomes extremely memorable. Now in organisations, we tend to actually do more of the first list rather than the second list, in that the lists of information that we provide in our dot points don't have any stories connected to them, so they're very hard for us to remember. So I guess that's one point I'd like to make about memory. Second thing is, how do you go about, this is sort of building on the question we asked before, how do you go about remembering a story? Well, I find that one of the simplest ways of doing this is when you come across a story that really grabs you and you think, God, that makes a really great point. What I do is I go and usually ring up, or I'm in the office and I tell my business partner, Mark, the story. And we have a conversation about it. We talk about, what does this story mean? What's the moral of this story, right? And I'll give you an example. I did some work for the Victorian Bushfire Reconstruction and Recovery Authority. And we, after the big fires in Victoria, the community recovery committees, there were 30 odd of these committees across the state, were all charged with the role of getting their community up and running again, right? But they were so busy just working on their community that they didn't have any connection really to any of the others. And so they weren't learning across the communities. So we wanted to get all the leaders together of these CRCs to see if we can connect them. And we thought, okay, well, let's connect them with getting them tell stories. And the idea is that, there's a lovely quote by Terence Gargiulo. He says that the shortest distance between two people is a story. Right? We kind of know this from our experience. Once you start sharing stories back and forwards, all of a sudden you become connected. But at the beginning of that session, I asked Christine Nixon, who was the chair of that organisation, to tell a story, and this is the one she told. She said, a couple of days after the fires, OPSM, which is a big spectacle maker and seller, put caravans out in the fire-affected areas. Right? And on this particular day, an elderly couple walked up to the caravan and the woman was complaining of grit in her eyes. Right? And so, they cleaned up her eyes, sorted her all out, and then they turned to the gentleman, her husband, and said, look, can we help you out in any way? And he said, well, I'm okay, I'm fine. He says, but I'm actually clinically blind because of diabetes. And I went, oh, okay. When was the last time you got checked up? He said, oh, a couple of years ago. And I went, oh, no, you've got to get checked up much more often than that. It's really important. Things are changing all the time. So anyway, they organised for him to go to an ophthalmologist. He gets checked out. It turns out he has a condition that they now have a new treatment for. Anyway, months after that, he gets this new treatment and he gets returned a big part of his sight. So I hear this story and I went, wow, that's amazing. So I tell Mark, and I said, Mark, what does that story mean to you? And he says, well, maybe it means even in the shittiest situations, good things can happen. So also I'd say, small things can make a big difference. That was the other one. And I jumped in and sort of said, the corporations need to be part of these recovery sort of efforts that are put in around the country. So by having that conversation, we're kind of tagging. It's almost like a neural tagging of that story, so that when someone mentions those topics in the future, that story will just pop in my head. But it doesn't pop into your head until you've told it a few times. I find if you tell it about 3 times, that story sticks in. Now, one of you have already said, but what about the numbers and the people's names? you actually have to use a bit of brute force to remember that. Because if those numbers are important, you've got to just get used to, in those 3 tellings, to include those numbers so that it just becomes part of those connections you're making to ensure that you can remember it. There's no real easy way. I mean, there are some techniques that the memory folk use, sort of associating names with images, because, we're great at remembering images, and emotions. You can do it that way, but I find you just have to make sure you repeat it many times. Now, I see, I was ahead of myself with questions, see? That was where I was going to do some questions. Anyway, we'll keep moving. Sharing stories. Well, I think there's a few different types of stories. Of course, there's many beyond what I'm just going to talk about here. If you like, the base of any storytelling is just to find an experience and make a point. I mean, that's as simple as that. But these story patterns are very useful. For example, a connection story is great when you are meeting people for the first time. And they want to get a sense of who you are, They want to know who you are, what makes you tick. And people are more influenced by people just like them, right? So, I told you my experience with the Australian Geological Survey Organisation as a bit of a connection story, sort of helping people understand that, we share some worlds in some ways. Influence stories are all about countering anti-stories, right? So for every story that, someone tells, like a leader tells, the organisation will come back with anti-stories. And the principle here is that you can't beat a story with fact. You can only beat it with a better story. Success stories are all those great, sort of successes we have, but we tend to tell them at too high a level. We tell them at the level of what an organisation has done for another organisation. Well, humans don't really care about that. They want to know what a human has done for other humans. It's about bringing it down. And the clarity story is sort of like the big daddy in this, because it answers the big question of why. Why are we doing something? So you might be changing your strategy, or you might be having a change program, or you might be trying to get someone to adopt a proposal that you're suggesting, or you're trying to get some funding. All these things, there's a why element to it, and clarity stories are fabulous for that. The clarity story pattern is a very basic one. It's simply this, in the past it was like this, and then something happened, so now that's why we're doing this change, this new strategy. This is why you need this new, proposed way of doing things, so that in the future we're going to achieve this. Right? In the past, then something happened, so now to achieve this. The crux of the story is in the then something happened. Right? That's the thing that explains why you're doing the activity that you're doing. But at the end of the day, it has to have a point. Right? You've got to know what your point is, and I really recommend that you share your point before you tell your story. So, if I was going to tell that Vibra story, the bushfire story, I'd sort of say, what, sometimes small things can make a big difference. A number of years ago, I was, working at the Victorian Bushfire Recovery Authority, and ... and you start to tell that story. That way, the person who's listening to the story knows what it's about. They know what the relevance of it is, and they will hang in there and they'll listen to your stories to get that point. And then through the story, a whole bunch of other benefits happen, in the sense that they get an understanding of your experience, and they get an understanding of a very concrete way to solve a problem. Gary Klein, I think, insight is one of the real big things that comes from storytelling, and I think he put it nicely when he said, insight is an unexpected shift to a better story. I think that's a lovely way of phrasing it. So a couple of important tips just to finish it off. The first one is, think about this scenario. Imagine you're standing in front of, say, a group of colleagues. You're trying to engage them in a new way of doing something, and you stand in front of them and you say, guys, I just want to start by sharing a story. What sort of immediate reaction do you get when you hear that? When I share that scenario with people in organisations, most people roll their eyes and they go, oh my God, do we have time for a story? Why don't you just give us the facts? It's even worse and more pronounced when I'm talking to bankers and insurance guys and engineers. But But let me rewind that, and we'll play a different scenario. So let's do this scenario where same situation. I'm standing in front of that group of people, and I say, last week something has changed in our business that I need to share with you. It's going to have a big impact on how we go forward. Right? What are people thinking now? They're going, well, what happened? What happened? We want to know what happened. And of course, you're still going to share a story, but you never use the S word, right? This is the thing that I think kills storytelling in organizations, is when people say, oh, I've got this story, or I've got this funny story. That's even worse, right? Never mention the S word. You want to just talk about your experience. You want to say things like, oh yeah, I actually had a really interesting experience that, will illustrate what I'm talking about. A couple of years ago, that's the time marker, ... in you go. Or you sort of say, yeah, I can think of an example that illustrates that. Again, you tell your story. You talk about experiences, examples, things that happened the other day, but you don't use the S word. The second tip that I'd leave you with is that you want to jump into moments. I've sort of been, I guess, reinforcing this idea that stories are not so much about words, they're about pictures. Right? So you want to get down to moments. That's where pictures come about. And finally, with the refresh, here are some of the signs, I think, that should give you that indication you should change your story. Of course, the first one is when you've just told it so many times before, right? You have to have some sympathy for your audience who have to hear the same story multiple times. In organisations, people don't seem to like the story more than once. The other one is that sometimes you lose interest in the story, and it really will show in your storytelling. So that's a good chance to refresh it. Context change. The environment changes. Sometimes a story that you used to tell in the past just no longer makes the point, so you've got to move on. And I guess related to that, you find the story just doesn't have the impact it used to have. Sometimes it's about, the other things that are happening in the broader community that sort of changes the impact of your story. When you move into a new organisation, that's a great time to tell new stories. People don't like to hear so much the stories about your old organisation. They tire of that very quickly. So you've got to quickly get new stories from the new company you're working in. And lastly, I'd say, sort of when you change jobs, when you're doing different roles, you kind of forming a new identity, and to do that, you really have to have new stories. Well, as John was saying, I've sort of written all this up, all these ideas in my new book, so please check that out, and feel free to get in contact with me if you have any questions. But this is probably a good time for us to, there's my contact details. Any questions that people have, more than happy to see if I can answer them for you.
Great, thanks for that, Shawn. So indeed we do have a number of questions. So the first one is, so regarding the clarity story structure that you talked about, Theo is suggesting that it sounds very similar to MSC, which is the most significant change. So the question is, when you do your story for leaders, do you start with a constructed vision, or are you collecting stories of change which bring out the clarity of the change desired?
Well, that's a really big question. I'm very familiar with most significant change. I've done most significant change projects. I've gone and collected lots of stories, and with most significant change, it's usually around two questions. What's the most significant change you've experienced as a result of the initiative that's been put in place? And people tend to tell you stories. And secondly, you want to then ask them, and so why is that significant for you? Because you start to dig into the values of people. So I don't think you get particularly structured stories per se out of that. You get all sorts of different types of stories. But it's very much a group process that you're going through. The clarity story is really when you're, you're walking into a situation where you're trying to answer that question, why? And people are looking for, what's the cause and effect? What's happened that helps us understand why we're doing this next thing? So that's why you have, okay, yeah, here's a bit of context setting, set up in the past it was like this, but you know what, something happened. You know, the GFC happened. There was a new competitor that came in that changed our markets. There was regulations that changed enormously. Now, something must have happened for us to do something differently. And once people understand that, they sort of go, oh, right, so that's why we're doing this. The group dynamic element of it is when you then get a group of people to develop that clarity story simultaneously. And then you get a whole bunch of people on the same page at the same time. It's a great thing to watch, actually.
Okay, great. Thanks, Shawn. So one of our astute attendees today, Georgie, has commented that you said earlier that people often don't want to hear a story more than once, but didn't you also say that for people to remember a story, you need to hear it or tell it 3 times?
That's right. You just don't tell it to the same audience, right? That's the trick. Well, it's not a trick so much, but yeah, you're right. People don't like to hear the same story over and over and over. So there's a couple of strategies you can take to learn a story so that you have it in the back pocket. Is you have to tell that story three times at least for it to stick, and you want to pick different audiences. Right? But if you're with just one group all the time, you're not going to get many opportunities to do that. In which case, you've got to take a strategy of, if you say you have this one idea that you really want to reinforce, it might be something to do with quality, right? In that case, every week you should be looking for a story that illustrates your principles of quality happening, so the following week you can tell that story. And that way the stories are always refresh and new, but you're reinforcing just this one idea, over time. It gives people very concrete examples of what to do and how to do it.
Okay, thanks, Shawn. Now, Marguerite, who's joining us from Canada tonight, her time, is kind of making a comment that businesses are always asking why and how to get us to get engagement in their products and causes. So is this where you could use business storytelling?
Yes, and it's sort of probably the main way in which people use, especially that clarity story. I had one general manager who had to pitch his, essentially his program of activities to his board to get funding for, the upcoming year. And instead of, getting the PowerPoint deck out and, and having all that sort of typical sort of presentation, he actually just told the story, a clarity story of what happened, what was changing, and what he was proposing to do. And he gave them a document which had all the data on it, included that data in his story. It was about a 10-minute telling of this version of this story. And, it was just nods, asked a few questions, and he got his funding. So it's that when people have a story in their head, that's when they go, oh, I get it, I know where you're going. Often in organisations, people have multiple different stories, and you've got competing stories, in which case that stops people from moving forward because they're all coming at it from different perspectives. So you're trying to not only tell the stories, but you're trying to elicit other people's stories and get them aligned behind a particular direction. If you're looking to make a change happen, for example.
That's good. Shawn, is there a time where you shouldn't use stories?
Yes, definitely. There's a number of places where stories will just cause you pain because, say for example, people ask you a very direct question. This is a bit of a ridiculous example, but just say they say, oh look, so how do you get down to the CBD from here? Well, you know what, 3 weeks ago I was, it's clearly not a place to tell a story, right? They just want the information. They're asking you for very specific facts, and you should be able to just give them the facts. It's only, stories work when you've got a bit more time and people are delving into the meaning and they're trying to get an understanding of where you're going. That's when you can tell a story. If you don't have that, you're best to back off, right? Mind you, you don't want to spend too much time, telling your story. I reckon stories should be told in 1 to 3 minutes. And what's really funny is that people think that storytelling takes longer than making your opinions. The number of times where people say, oh, we don't have time for stories, just give me the facts, and then the person spends 20 minutes describing the facts, so-called facts, when a couple of clear stories of, what not to do and what to do, would have actually probably done a better job. So yeah.
Great. Okay. Okay, good. And talking of time, we're running out, so just a few more questions, but if you can keep your answers succinct. So Neil asks, do you see business storytelling as any different to using storytelling in as an educational tool in the vocational education and training sector, which is a competency-based training, as you'll probably be aware?
Yeah. No, I don't see it as any. There's no difference.
No difference?
There's no difference, absolutely. It's just the type of stories you tell that are different, that's all. But all the techniques and the approaches are exactly the same.
Great.
Yeah. So, yeah.
Okay. And it seems that your clients are very happy with oral stories. Is there a tension, though, with the number crunchers in the room wanting harder evidence versus the lovely stories?
See, people assume that stories equals lovely stories, right? But, if you listen to an analytical person describe what's going on, they tell analytical stories, right? I'm working with an insurance company at the moment, and their actuaries, say things like, well, we had a couple of days ago, we had 2 points going up on the, the XYZ scale of the, and then of course there was a drop. It went down 15 points. Well, we had to redistribute our funds to the 4 different markets. They just tell those types of stories, right? So everyone in every walk of life tells stories, but they're just not aware of it, right? They just think they're being really analytical, which they are, but they're doing it in a narrative way.
Okay, and just finally, Marguerite makes a comment that she was recently at a conference where they were talking about telling your value proposition through storytelling, which is very much what I'm hearing you talking about there, Shawn. And she's after more tips, so I'm guessing maybe your book or one of your workshops.
Yeah, well, that's certainly definitely. Hopefully, you'll get lots of good information there. But value propositions. If you're thinking about elevator pitches, I hate that phrase, but people talk about elevator pitches. I reckon the way to do that is to tell like a tiny story, like you bump into someone. What do you do, Shawn? I can sort of say, well, imagine one of your leaders standing in front of their employees and everyone is hanging on every word that she's saying. They're leaning into that, right? That's what storytelling does. And imagine if you could amplify that to everywhere across your business. So you're using this tiny moment to help people understand what you're about, your value proposition, by sort of giving them this idea that, yeah, look at that, but imagine that timed by, 1,000 or 10,000. So that's one way of thinking about it.
Brilliant. Okay, we'll hold things there. Shawn, thank you so much for your lovely presentation. I've really enjoyed the way that you've explained it, and of course we'd expect that from you, being a professional storyteller as such in a business context. So thanks for sharing your expertise with us today.
Pleasure, John.
Now, today's webinar has been brought to us all today by the High Impact Training, which is the new company that I've recently established in my spare time. So please make sure that you sign up to hear about new webinars and workshops that are coming your way soon. And I'll send you a link to the recording of today's webinar and any other resources in the next day or so. And of course, I'm keen to hear what you thought of today's webinar. So I'll send everyone a link in due course to an online survey, and our monkeys will be waiting to read your responses. Now, in actual fact, I read each and every response, and I often reply by email to people who ask questions or make pertinent comments. So folks, thanks for coming along and interacting with us today. It's been great to have you with us for this inaugural HIT webinar. All your names will go down in history. It's been just so nice to have people from all parts of Australia. So I've noticed people from Brisbane, Sydney, Cairns, Darwin, Perth, and even Wondai. Thanks for coming along, Sue. And folks from overseas like in New Zealand and in Canada. So thanks everyone for being here today. It's been lovely to engage with you, and I wish you all the very best until we meet again. Hooroo for now.